If you knew where you could get your hands on $300 million worth of diamonds, and you had the ability to do so, would you? Most people wouldn't hesitate to answer yes to that question. But what if the diamonds were located some 2 miles beneath the ocean waves, in the cargo hold of the doomed ocean liner Titanic?
The Titanic has fascinated the public since it plunged to the bottom of the ocean in April of 1912. Could it be that an upcoming attempt to retrieve the Titanic's lost treasures will finally answer all the unresolved questions about the tragedy that claimed so many lives? How could a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable go down in just 2.5 hours? Did Titanic's collision with the iceberg really tear such a huge hole in the ship's hull that the ship never stood a chance? Or was there trouble deep within the bowels of the ship that sealed its fate even before it left port? Could it be that the Titanic's captain made a fatal error in his effort to save the ship? And is it possible that a German U-boat lurking in the dark waters of the North Atlantic that night had something to do with the ship's ultimate demise? You may think you've heard it all when it comes to the Titanic, but wait until you see what lies just ahead.
Now let's turn to the fate of the world's first unsinkable ship.
Almost 90 years after the disaster, we still assume that Titanic's collision with an iceberg was the cause of her sinking. But is this the truth? Or were there much more sinister forces at work? Most disturbing of all is the recent suggestions that there could have been more survivors of the Titanic disaster that somehow never made it to the rescue ship. What happened to these lost souls? Will new evidence about this well-known disaster rewrite history, or perhaps just open up old wounds?
The unsinkable Titanic proved to be anything but that. And yet, ill-fated as it was, the legend of this great ship continues to draw us to the bottom of the sea. For some, it's the romance of a bygone era that attracts them to Titanic. For others, the reasons are much more practical and profitable. You see, RMS Titanic isn't just a ship. It's a corporation that holds the exclusive salvage rights to the actual wreck. Their present goal? To retrieve a fabulous cache of diamonds located in the ship's front cargo hold.
Some of the wealthiest and most famous people of the day traveled on Titanic's maiden voyage, so it's no surprise that there are many valuable items in the ship's cargo hold. Among the things the RMS Titanic Incorporated would like to retrieve are a vintage Renault automobile and an ancient poetry book with a gem-encrusted cover. But the most valuable item they hope to retrieve is a shipment of diamonds that today would be worth over $300 million.
But the quest for treasure may yield something far more valuable: the truth. In the year 2000, RMS Titanic, Inc. announced plans to cut into the hull of the great ship in order to retrieve its valuable cargo. But why would this be necessary? Didn't the iceberg tear a huge hole in the side of the ship? For decades, this belief was widely accepted. But is it true? The night of April 14, 1912, was cold and clear. Titanic's bow lunged through a glassy sea, seemingly unaware of the dangers that lay ahead. Suddenly, out of nowhere, an iceberg emerged from the dark night. The lookouts on Titanic immediately informed the bridge. The order was given to make an evasive maneuver, and ever so slowly, the ship began to turn. But it was too late. According to eyewitness testimony, the berg dug its icy claws into the ship as it dragged along Titanic's side. In an instant, the great ship was fatally wounded. Or was she?
The Titanic was constructed of the finest steel for her time. The vessel actually was constructed from 1907 to 1911. In 1991, we recovered steel from the debris field on the ocean floor for metallurgical testing, both in the United States and Canada. The steel that was recovered was tested in Canada in 1992. The results of those metallurgical analyses indicated there was a high sulfur content in the steel, which led the researchers to believe that the steel was brittle. When the metallurgical results were made public in 1993, brittle steel was blamed for the disaster. This led some historians to conclude that the steel of Titanic shattered like glass as the iceberg scraped by.
Based on the theory that brittle steel played a role in the tragedy, researchers theorized that the iceberg left a 300-foot gash in the side of the ship. But new evidence contradicts those findings.
When the deep-sea researchers discovered the bow wreck of the Titanic in 1985, they were unable to visually inspect the area of hull damage due to the iceberg encounter because the bow was partially buried in sediments. The only way these researchers could see the hull damage caused by the iceberg was to use a specialized subprofiler that could see through the sediments and obtain digital and graphic images of the hull. These images proved that there was no large gash. Instead, there were 6 separate narrow slits in riveted seams along the starboard hull, amounting to approximately 12 square feet in area.
How could 12 square feet of damage cause the world's greatest luxury liner to sink in less than 3 hours? Even the experts have had a hard time explaining that fact. But evidence has finally been uncovered that might explain the mystery.
Although my fascination with the Titanic began when I was very young, it peaked in 1983 when I was invited to join the Titanic search mission as project artist and historian. This led to my intrigue surrounding the ship's final hours, especially the mystery of why it sank so fast.
After an exhaustive study of testimony given by Titanic's surviving passengers and crew, an amazing untold story has begun to emerge.
Until now, everyone has assumed that Titanic hit the iceberg, reversed its engines, stopped its forward motion, and sank. But that just isn't true. From eyewitness survivor testimony, I proved that after Titanic came to a complete stop, Captain Smith ordered half speed ahead, after which the vessel resumed her forward progress. Based on the information I found, it's apparent that Titanic resumed her course for at least 15 minutes after the collision.
This shocking new evidence is backed up by the testimony of passengers and crew members, including the senior-ranking surviving officer of the Titanic disaster. Could the fact that Captain Smith kept Titanic under power even after the collision have something to do with the speed at which Titanic was claimed by the sea?
The fact that Titanic moved on for 15 minutes or more is astonishing because it had everything to do with how quickly the ship sank. The forward motion caused seawater to be forced into the hole at the bow at a rate of over 12 tons a minute. This caused the ship to sink much faster than it would have had it not moved on again. At the time, Captain Smith had no idea how seriously his ship had been damaged and that he was only making matters worse. Had the Titanic not moved on again, it probably could have stayed afloat for at least several more hours. That would have given the rescue ship Carpathia enough time to reach Titanic before she foundered. Given that scenario, it's quite possible that everyone aboard the Titanic could have been saved.
Why did Captain Smith order the ship to continue at half speed? Shouldn't he have known that this would force more seawater into the cargo holds below? The same cargo holds where the millions of dollars in diamonds might still be found?
Veteran Captain Smith was considered by many to be the best captain of the White Star Line, and so it would appear strange that he would make such a grave mistake. But he was actually following maritime procedure. Captain Smith did exactly as he was trained to do in a crisis of this manner. He attempted to get his wounded vessel as close to safety as possible. That meant either getting the vessel to shallow water or closer to another ship that might be able to render aid. At one point on the night the Titanic sank, the freighter Californian was but 5 to 6 miles from Titanic's position. Her lights were visible to passengers and crew, as pointed out by the top-ranking surviving officer Charles Lightoller. Undoubtedly, Captain Smith had been desperately trying to reach the Californian before Titanic sank. In theory, he was doing the right thing, but tragically and unknowingly, he made the wrong move.
Should Captain Smith bear all the blame for the Titanic disaster? After all, His decision to continue moving forward proved to be fatal for the ship and most of its passengers. Or were there other forces at work inside the ship that contributed to its rapid demise?
Titanic used vast amounts of coal to fire its huge boilers. And one of the dangers of this kind of energy is that coal was subject to spontaneous combustion, i.e. coal fires. These were very common, and as any sailor will tell you, fire on board the ship at sea can be catastrophic. What none of the passengers and very few of the crew of the Titanic knew was that when she left Southampton that day, there was a significant fire burning on her starboard side near boiler room number 6. The fire burned continuously throughout Titanic's voyage, despite the crew's best efforts to try to put it out.
Did the coal fire burning deep within Titanic play a role in the disaster? Interestingly enough, the most significant damage to the ship extends between boiler rooms number 5 and number 6 on the starboard side, just crossing the watertight bulkhead. Is this coincidence? Or did the coal fire weaken the bulkhead enough to allow for more severe damage when the iceberg hit? Startling as this new evidence may be, the most outrageous story is yet to come. Could it be that Titanic's collision with the iceberg was not what sunk the ship? Evidence of a conspiracy has come to light that will send our investigation in a sinister direction. Is it possible that the sinking of Titanic was an act of war? Unsinkable. That's the ironic description most often associated with the ill-fated Titanic. But what really caused this great ship to founder? Was it an iceberg, as most people assume? Or was it an unseen enemy?
The one thing people think that they know about Titanic, that fateful night in April 1912, is that she struck an iceberg. However, based on survivors' testimony, we cannot necessarily make that assumption. In fact, if you look at the evidence, the only thing that we can take for granted is that Titanic skimmed past the iceberg, barely making contact. Sub-profiler images of Titanic's hull have now proven that the damage she sustained was not as bad as we first thought. So something else must have been responsible for the Titanic's loss that night.
Far-fetched as it may sound, there is evidence to support this new theory.
The United States Senate held hearings in order to find out what had gone wrong in the Titanic disaster. Many passengers testified that they had not felt anything when the Titanic hit an iceberg. Only a handful of people testified that they had felt a jolt as the iceberg slipped past.
Is it possible that damage to the Titanic's hull was as minimal as the impact seemed to be? And if the collision did not cause Titanic's mortal wound, then what did?
Many of the survivors who were huddled in the lifeboats that night reported seeing a strange light from a nearby ship, almost like a beam from a searchlight. When they saw the light, they were encouraged, because they all thought the ship would come to their aid. But it never did. There has been a lot of speculation as to the identity of that mystery ship that night. The most widely accepted view is that it was the Californian. But to his dying day, the captain of the Californian, Captain Lord, insisted that there was another ship between his ship, the Californian, and Titanic, and that it was this mystery ship that failed to go to the aid of Titanic. On the night Titanic sank, the Californian was surrounded by a large ice field, so Captain Lord ordered that they stop for the night.
After the Californian had stopped for the night, Captain Lord told the ship's radio officer to send a message to any nearby ships informing them of the ice danger, and then Captain Lord went to bed.
During the night, the sailors on watch, including Third Officer Groves, say that they saw an unidentified vessel some 5 to 10 miles from their location. That unidentified vessel was there until about 2 a.m. when she steamed away from the Californian. Captain Lord would later claim that this ship was not Titanic, but an unidentified ship that was in the area that night.
Was the Californian the only ship near Titanic when she went down? Or could there have been a third ship, the mystery ship, as Captain Lord claimed? And if there was another ship, why did the mysterious vessel do nothing to help the dying liner?
Remember that the Titanic survivors reported seeing a searchlight that night from a mystery ship. There is a possibility that this searchlight could have been coming from a German submarine. And the reason that it did not go to the aid of the survivors was that it had either just collided with Titanic or used its torpedoes to sink the Titanic.
When Titanic went down on that fateful night, hundreds of people lost their lives. Is it possible that this maritime tragedy was actually an act of war? Outrageous as it may sound, there is circumstantial evidence to support this theory.
When questioned by a Senate inquiry panel, several Titanic crew members and passengers testified that they heard explosions deep in the bowels of the ship after the ship struck the iceberg. And one of the Titanic officers said he heard 4 reports, like the reports of a big gun in the distance.
As unlikely as the U-boat scenario may seem, these eyewitness accounts cannot be ignored. But do they point to the presence of an underwater enemy?
If you look at the facts, you'll see that the U-boat theory is very plausible. By 1912, the German Navy had perfected the U-boat design. At the time of the Titanic disaster, the political turmoil that would eventually lead to World War I was already brewing, and the German Navy had sent U-boats out on patrol in the North Atlantic.
If a German submarine was in the area the night the Titanic went down, it's reasonable to assume they wanted to avoid drawing attention to themselves simply for political reasons. Is this why they didn't come to Titanic's aid? Or could it be they had a hand in sinking the Titanic? It's impossible to say for sure, but something stood between the Titanic and those who might have rescued her passengers. Perhaps the search for a fortune in diamonds may provide us with a clue. As outrageous as the U-boat idea sounds at this point in history, it would not have been that unthinkable in 1912.
In 1915, just 3 years after Titanic, a U-boat torpedoed and sank the British passenger liner Lusitania. Lusitania was gone in just 18 minutes, and more than 1,200 people lost their lives. The attack on Lusitania came without warning, and although we now know that Germany was responsible, they refused to acknowledge that responsibility at the time.
Could it be that Germany's aggression in World War I began with a torpedo attack on the Titanic? There is one fact, however, that cannot be disputed. More than 1,500 people lost their lives on that frigid April night. Just after dawn, a little more than 700 survivors were picked up by the rescue ship Carpathia. But the mystery of Titanic doesn't end there. Were the people in these lifeboats really the only survivors of this great tragedy? Or could it be that even more lives were lost because of one man's awful decision?
Before Captain Lord retired for the evening, he instructed his wireless operator on board the Californian to send out an ice warning. The wireless operator did this, and then he went to bed as well. 20 minutes later, Titanic struck an iceberg. The Titanic's wireless operator, Jack Phillips, sent out repeated distress calls, but by that time no one on board the Californian was listening.
Did Titanic's distress calls go completely unnoticed by the Californian? Or had someone tried to listen in? While making his rounds that night, 3rd Officer Groves of the Californian stopped by the wireless room. He put on the headphones, but heard nothing. Unfortunately, he'd failed to notice that the clockwork of the magnetic detector had run down. No signals could be received until it was wound up again. The time was 12:25 a.m., 10 minutes after Titanic's distress signals began to fill the air.
The next morning, when the Californian's wireless operator signed on, he finally heard the news. Titanic was gone. Captain Lord was informed, and the Californian quickly made its way to the site, but it was too late.
The story of Captain Lord's negligence on that night was widely reported in the press, and the ensuing scandal ended up costing him his career. But what happened next is even more shocking, and remains to this day one of Titanic's biggest mysteries. Is it possible that Captain Lord may have inadvertently left some survivors behind?
By the time the Californian reached the area where the Titanic sank, the Carpathia had already picked up survivors. Of course, these people were anxious to get to New York, But before the Carpathia departed, they asked Captain Lord to search the area one last time.
According to Third Officer Groves, the Californian searched Titanic's lifeboats again and found them all to be empty. He then scanned the area and saw something strange.
Groves told Captain Lord that he saw movement on an ice floe about a mile away from the Californian. He suggested that they check it out to see if there could possibly be more survivors. Captain Lord told Groves that the figures he saw were just seals, but he didn't bother to make sure. He just turned his ship around and headed for their original destination of Boston and never looked back.
What about those figures on the ice floe? Were they seals, as the captain had said, or were they survivors?
We know that the Californian double-checked all lifeboats to make sure they were empty. But a month later, in almost the same spot where the Titanic went down, the White Star liner Majestic picked up a Titanic lifeboat. The bodies were brought on board the Majestic, where the ship's doctor examined them. He found the mouths contained cork from the lifebelts they had in the boat. He concluded they died of starvation.
Is it possible that some of Titanic's passengers were able to save themselves from the frigid waters by climbing onto a nearby ice floe? If so, it wouldn't have been the first time.
It is possible to survive on an ice floe for a short period of time. The survivors of the wreck Endurance are a famous example. In 1910, polar explorer Ernest Shackleton and his crew suddenly found themselves without a vessel. Their ship, the Endurance, had been crushed in the heavy pack ice near the South Pole. They climbed from the ship directly onto the ice. Using the supplies they'd saved, they lived there until they were able to reach open water and launch their lifeboats. Eventually, the crew of the Endurance was rescued. Unfortunately, some of Titanic's victims may not have been so lucky.
As with the story of Titanic herself, there are no easy answers to the mystery of her lost survivors. How were they able to eventually reach the lifeboats? Did ocean currents bring them close enough to the ice floe for them to climb in? And once on board the lifeboats, how long did they wait for the rescue that never came? The sinking of the luxury liner Titanic is, without a doubt, one of the greatest tragedies in maritime history. Unfortunately, the people who survived the disaster are themselves nearly all gone, and with them has gone the first-hand accounts that may have solved Titanic's mysteries. All that remains, it seems, is the ghostly shell of the ship itself, and now even that is in danger. Will the final resting place of Titanic's lost souls be disturbed for the sake of recovering its sunken treasure? So far, bad weather and equipment failures have prevented salvors from retrieving the more than $300 million in diamonds reportedly still aboard the doomed ship. But the company hasn't given up hope of someday penetrating Titanic's hull and coming back with the loot. But what will they find inside the great ship? Sunken treasure or something much more valuable? Will the Titanic finally give up the last of her secrets? RMS Titanic may be interested in searching for diamonds, but the rest of the world would like to know if it really was an iceberg that sank the first and only unsinkable ship.